Good evening from the Gail Lemron Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Welcome to the President Speaker Series. On behalf of our host, President John P. Johnson, I'm Mark Bernier, the moderator for tonight's event. Terrorism has become a way of life for so many people in the world, and there are reasons why it happens. Tonight, that's the theme of our talk, the 15 reasons why terrorism exists. In a town hall fashion discussion, we'll talk with an expert on this topic and the author of a new book. Then we'll take questions from the audience about the 15 points he brings up. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest for tonight on Terrorism and Communication, the author of the new book on the same topic. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jonathan Matusitz.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. Dr. Matusitz, thanks for being with us. A little bit of background for the people who have perhaps not heard you or seen you before. What led you to write about this and teach this subject?
Well, most books on terrorism are in political science, in criminal justice. Very few books are in communication. In fact, there was no book, no big book, mixing both fields, terrorism and communication. So I took the opportunity to write a book, and Sage, a social sciences publisher, said, yes, we will publish it.
We're going to go through the 15 points, and I'm asking Dr. Matusitz to sort of outline examples of how and why this happens. There are various forms of terrorism, obviously. There's terrorism that happens on the domestic front and international terrorism. And to begin, we've just come off of the Olympics. And what was the #1 worry for the participants and those of hosting countries? Would there be terrorism there?
Yes, Sochi is located where the Circassians used to live. The Circassians were an ethnic minority group, and apparently in 1864, February of 1864, so if you do the math, it's exactly 150 years before the Olympics, and the Circassians were discriminated, and many of them were killed by the Russians. And the fact that Russia was holding the Olympics there was a good way for the Circassians to wreak revenge against the Russians. So the main concern was terrorism as a form of retaliation.
We're thankful there were no major incidents. There was a war that was happening just outside of the perimeter. Were you surprised that there were not acts of terrorism?
The Russian secret police was very good at foiling these terrorist attacks.
A little bit of background, you're originally from Belgium?
That's correct. I was born and raised in Belgium, like Dr. Evil.
How many languages do you speak? Is it 2 or 3
I used to
now?
speak 3, French, Dutch, and English. I haven't spoken Dutch in 15 years. Now it's down to 2, French and English.
What got you to this country? What was it that brought you here?
The land of opportunity. See?
All family back in Europe?
I wanted to discover America. And I'm a movie buff and watching all these movies. And finally, I got here in 2000. I've been living here for 14 years.
All the time at UCF?
No, from Belgium, I went to Alaska to get my master's. From Alaska, I went to Oklahoma to get my doctorate. And as I was looking for jobs, UCF hired me in the summer of 2006. So I've lived here for 7.5 years.
Dr. Matusitz reminded me that it was about 2 years ago when we had Zuhdi Jasser here. And Dr. Matusitz was in the audience and came up and gave me his card and introduced, and then I started watching the classes that you were teaching and then the events that you were doing at UCF. And then when we were putting the series together, in talking with Homeland Security and a few other folks here at Embry-Riddle, I said, we should do this. And this is how we came to do this tonight.
It's good to see a lot of adults and a lot of young people. I give a lot of talks like this, and it's mostly adults who attend, but here I see a lot of young people, so thank you for being here.
Let's talk about the 15 points and go through them one at a time and give some examples of where in the world these reasons are being employed. And I'm going to do religion at the end. I'll just tell you, it's huge and it opens up for several other things. But you list oppression as one of the reasons why terrorism exists. Give us some examples, please.
Well, the best example today, since the 1990s until today, oppression leads to revenge. And a lot of the Chechen terrorists say that the Russian army oppresses them. and a lot of Chechen men get killed by the Russians. So a lot of the wives, the widows, become suicide bombers, and we call them the Czech black widows, like the spider. So if you follow the metaphor, a widow can kill you, and the Chechen black widows feel oppressed, and they want to seek revenge against the Russians. Most of the suicide bombers in Chechnya are actually females. So that would be an example of oppression right there.
Historical grievances. Now, this is interesting because it can take on all kinds of life.
Historical grievances refers to a wrong that needs to be repaired, that needs to be restored. So it's a group of people that wants to get even with the enemy, even though the wrong was committed 1,000 years ago. For example, the Basque terrorist group, ETA, and the Basques live in Spain and France, and they want to regain their territory, and they want to have their own independent state. And they say that France and Spain stole their territory. We have the Palestinians as an example of historical grievances. We have the IRA. They want to get back 6 counties from Northern Ireland. Their main slogan is Brits out.
And I want to stay with that for a while, because years ago, we would hear about terrorism in Ireland. We don't hear as much about that now. Have they settled some of their grievances?
The IRA is barely active today. In fact, some of them have become members of the British Parliament. They were big in the 60s and 70s.
I was reading several weeks ago, in anticipation of our get-together, another part of American history. I want to stay with this for a moment. During the early part of the last century, there were terrorist acts from Mexico into the United States. There was resentment, I guess, grievances of the territorial takes by the United States and the purchases of land. And I think it was Blackjack Pershing who was really committing terrorist acts over the Texas border, right?
Absolutely. No, you mentioned Mexico. The main concern today is the Mexican drug war, and a lot of the Mexican drug lords are joining forces with groups like Hezbollah, the Shia terrorist group from Iran and headquartered in Lebanon.
Yeah, stay with that for a second, because what's in it for them? Don't they know how dangerous these folks can be?
They operate on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the common enemy for Hezbollah and Mexican drug lords is America. So sometimes enemies will join forces because they have a common denominator. In this case, it's America.
Moving along, these are part of the 15 reasons. Violation of international law.
That is the perception that some of the Western countries did not fulfill their promises. For example, Great Britain promised the Palestinians under the Balfour Declaration that the Palestinians would have a lot of rights, and the Palestinian people felt that Britain betrayed them. That's an example of the one that you mentioned. During the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, there were talks about granting autonomy for the Palestinians, and they failed for Arab countries. And again, they felt that those promises were not fulfilled. There's a gazillion examples under that rubric.
Does the Bosnian conflicts and the bombings that have happened, does that fall under the international law violations?
No, that falls under the second one, historical grievances. The Serbs and the Croats have always fought, and the Bosniaks are Bosnian Muslims, and the Bosnian Serbs have never gotten along. In fact, the Bosnian Serbs killed a lot of Bosniaks and raped a lot of the Bosniak women from 1992 until 1995, a war that killed 100,000 people.
Wow. Relative deprivation.
Relative deprivation is code for poverty. It is true that in places like Gaza and the West Bank, some people make $4 to $5 a day, and their life on earth, as you can imagine, is miserable. And because they live in abject misery, they will join suicide commandos and martyrdom operations, which is code for suicide operations. When you join a suicide commando, your family is being promised up to $2,000, and your siblings get scholarships to go to college, so no tuition for them. That would be poverty. But now look at it this way. The 19 hijackers came from rich families in Saudi Arabia, and the main leader was Mohammed Atta, who was 33. He came from Egypt. So there's not always a correlation between poverty and terrorism. There is some correlation.
When you discuss these points in your classrooms, what's the reaction from the students? I saw a Channel 9 report about your class, and they came out, the interviews, they all were very supportive. But do they understand everything that you're giving them?
I understand that this is a tough subject. I teach in the School of Communication. They take culture, interpersonal communication, online friendship. So they move from these classes to terrorism. So that's a heck of a switch. So of course, some of them get taken back. Wow, so much information. We talk about beheadings and war rape. So some of them, I would say, are not offended by what I say, but they're offended by the topic in and of itself.
I should have asked you this.
It's intense.
Okay, I should have asked you this up front. How do you define terrorism?
Before I define terrorism, let me tell you where the word comes from. The word is 220 years old. At the end of the French Revolution in 1793, 1794, the guillotine was being used on anybody disagreeing with the government. What was the government called? The government of terror. Terror. So the leaders of the government of terror were called the terrorists. So the word terrorism was used for the first time by the people themselves. We are the terrorists. That was in French. And the first time the word appeared in English was in 1798. So at the end of the 18th century. Now, terrorism has 212 definitions. For some people, if I brush you, I'm a terrorist. For some of the Chinese, a monk from Tibet is a terrorist. We call them terrorists. They call themselves freedom fighters. We call them terrorists or suicide bombers. They call themselves martyrs, heroes. Fortunately, in 1988, two scholars from Holland, Schmidt and Youngman, looked at all the definitions, and this is what they said. We're going to look at the commonalities among all the definitions. So they did a content analysis, and they found out that in 83.5% of all these definitions, the word violence appeared. In 65% of all these 200 definitions, the words political goals appeared. And in 51% of all these definitions, the words causing fear and terror appeared. So finally, 25 years ago, we had a definition that was comprehensive and that most governments could agree on. And the definition was this: terrorism is the use of fear and terror in order to reach political goals.
Were Americans in our history ever accused of terrorism against each other? And I think of the Klan. I think of sometimes acts against Native Americans. What are some examples of terrorism within our own country?
Oh, definitely the KKK. Definitely with their lynching, and they have a special knife called the Bowie knife. And the Bowie knife is like Crocodile Dundee. And they would slash people's throats. Just by looking at the terrorist practices of the KKK, that makes them a terrorist group. You have the Aryan Nation, and the Aryan Nation, as you can hear it, is a neo-Nazi group, very racist against blacks and Jews. We had Tim McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing perpetrator. He was only 26 years old when he committed that horrifying act. This is where I got my doctorate. Close to the Oklahoma City bombing. So in 2002, when I went to Oklahoma, I went to the site, and it's really in the boondocks. Timothy McVeigh chose a building. Instead of choosing the skyscraper or the Empire State Building, he chose a building in the boondocks because he knew that he would receive the attention from anybody. See, when I lived in Belgium, I didn't know what Oklahoma was. Is that a new band? So finally, Oklahoma was on the map. It took a sad terrorist act to put Oklahoma on a map.
Is there something that's happening, to stay with that for a moment, is there something that's happening in this country that's making people act out more in terrorist fashion?
I would say that law enforcement in the U.S. has gotten better foiling terrorist attacks. If you look at the FBI statistics of terrorist attacks, they have decreased sharply. The number of attempts at killing people has increased. So there is an inverse relation between the number of terrorist attempts and the number of successful terrorist attacks.
Do the people who are the terrorists somehow think that maybe I won't be the one that's caught? Or I won't have to sacrifice my life in the name of terror?
In some cases, the terrorist doesn't think about that. Am I going to get caught? Do I care? I want to fulfill my mission. That's how they operate. They want to reach their goals.
Something you wrote called Hatred Toward Global Hegemony?
Hegemony.
Hegemony.
Hegemony is the scientific term for power. It's like an anti-Western sentiment, an anti-American imperialism sentiment. We call that West toxification. So hatred of the West, West toxification, a word that was used by the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini. So it's a terrorist sentiment against the World Trade Organization, against McDonald's. A lot of the KFC restaurants have been blown up in Pakistan. They don't like the idea of Barbie dolls in some countries. They see it as cultural invasion, and they're against it.
In going through the 15 reasons why terrorism exists, you outline one of the reasons is financial reward. How often does that happen?
That doesn't happen very often. Most terrorists don't get paid for what they do. I gave you the example of the Palestinian suicide bombers. They don't get a financial gain, but they know their family, most of whom live in poverty, get some financial rewards. In South America, there is a group in Colombia called FARC, the Colombian Revolutionary Armed Forces, and FARC they're notorious for abducting people for ransom. So they will abduct political figures and get $1 million out of them. So,
stopping for just a moment.
Kidnapping.
All terrorism is not active violence. Sometimes it's internet terrorism, banking terrorism. There are other things to put fear and suppression to people. I mean, is this going to become a new wave of terrorism that's much more common? Those things that strike through the internet, through the financial communities?
Cyber terrorism happens on an hourly basis, but the damage of it is insignificant. The Pentagon gets hacked 5,000 times a year, for example, by a Chinese group called Titan Rain. But of course, our side of things is really good at thwarting any cyber terrorist attacks. But if they succeed delving into computer networks, they can cause millions of dollars in damage. That doesn't happen very often.
Do you talk much about an EMP as a method of terrorism to wipe out the electrical grid of a country?
Yeah, EMP stands for the electromagnetic pulse, and it's like a nuclear bomb, but it does not really explode on the ground. See, a nuclear bomb would explode on the ground, and an EMP is launched like this, and it explodes up in the air, and what it does is that it shuts down anything that's under its umbrella. So anything that works on electricity, on waves, like a pacemaker, like your car, your cell phones, stops. So if an EMP is launched from a barge in Venezuela on top of Kansas, and if the radius is 2,000 miles, it can cause a lot of damage. It looks great on paper. They're not ready to have it. And if they launch an EMP, we launch one above it, and it shuts down their EMP.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
So we have a method to stop an EMP? Because we talked
Let's pray it doesn't happen, because it's cheap to make it, it's not big, and it can be launched not from the US, but from Cuba or Venezuela. It looks good on paper, but I doubt it's going to happen tomorrow. At least we know it. We know they want to do it.
We know from talking to a couple of military leaders that we have the ability to do it ourselves, but there's been a worry that some of these developing countries who don't have the armament that we do might just launch one.
Well, if we launch an EMP on developing countries, they will accuse us of being using nuclear weapons on them, even though it's not a nuclear weapon. And that would be against the Geneva Conventions. See, under the Geneva Conventions, you should use tanks and rifles, nothing like EMPs or nuclear weapons.
I'm going through this material kind of quickly because I want to give an opportunity for those of you who have assembled here to ask your questions of Jonathan. Another of the 15 reasons why terrorism exists is racism. And you gave an example in the talk that I saw on YouTube of the Texas Aryan Brotherhood?
Yeah, the Texas Aryan Brotherhood is a neo-Nazi group that formed in an American prison. Now, in a lot of American prisons, there are some neo-Nazi groups that form. And when they get out of prison, they have those cells that coalesce and lead to that group. It has been on the FBI list of terrorists for the past 20 to 30 years.
Guilt by association.
Guilt by association is when you strike a target who has nothing to do with your enemy directly. I'll give you an example. Madrid, so Spain, had its own 9/11. It was on March 11, 2004. And Al-Qaeda killed 200 people by bombing 4 trains at the Madrid train station. Why? Why kill Spanish people, Spanish tourists? Because Spain had troops in Iraq. And of course, people like Osama bin Laden were upset that the West was in Iraq. So as a form of retaliation, they saw the Spanish people as helping George Bush and its troops in Iraq. That would be guilt by association. That could also be an example whereby a leader in Africa is considered pro-West. Who put you there? The West, the FBI? The leader doesn't help its people. So the local people think that the leader is on the same side as America, as Great Britain. Right? That would be guilt by association. So you'll have rebellions against that leader. You see that in Rwanda, in the Congo, in various African countries today.
I wasn't expecting this one. Support of sympathizers.
Support of sympathizers is when you kill people to expand your support base. Until Osama bin Laden killed 3,000 people on that day of infamy, 9/11, very few people knew him, even in the Muslim world. But of course, he became a household name after that event. And his support increased.
His support increased?
Oh, yeah.
Where were you on 9/11?
I was in Alaska. I was sleeping in my dorm.
Really?
Yeah.
What were you
Someone
thinking?
knocked on my door, America is under attack. Now, Alaska here, when it's 10 o'clock here, it's more like probably 5 in the afternoon. And so I was shocked like everybody.
Did you stay in Alaska, or did you move when
After
travel
Alaska,
started?
I went to Oklahoma to get my doctorate.
Wow. But during that time, the immediate period, did you feel a need to leave Alaska or to go back to Europe?
Well, I was
anything?
scared, but I was not enough scared to leave the country. I was sad. I was saddened, like most people.
Mortality salience.
Yeah, mortality salience is not not a concept we encounter every day. It answers the question, how should I die? And I would imagine that most people in this country want to die as old as a turtle when they're 150. But in some cultures, people want to die they want to be recognized for who they are. They want to die as a martyr. In the Palestinian territories, in the Gaza Strip, when a suicide bomber accomplishes his mission successfully or her mission successfully, his or her face is being shown on the main street. On billboards, it's like the Leonardo DiCaprio of the plays, and his or her face is shown on the main street for weeks. And for them, it's like social status.
But they're not here anymore. They're dead. They do this so they can be famous?
Do you think they care? They don't care. They want to please their God. They want to please their culture.
So they sacrifice themselves.
Absolutely. This is how they want to die.
And then,
so we call it clash of civilization. Some of these people in Gaza don't think the same way. To us, it's unconscionable, it's unimaginable. Don't you like life? If you look at documentaries on Palestinian suicide bombers, this is what they're going to say. We love death the way you love life.
Wow. Narcissism.
Narcissism as a reason to commit terrorism is rare. There are people who have a big ego. They have a larger-than-life ego, and they need to make themselves known. So they will lead a terrorist group so that the whole world will pay attention to what they do.
Can you give me an example of that? Because I've never heard of this before.
An example of this was Baader-Meinhof, the Red Army faction. And it was a German terrorist group before I was born in the early 70s. And these were successful grad students. They had a bright future. They had a promising future. I don't know if they were bored with life, but they decided to join to create that terrorist movement, an anti-capitalist movement. They were anti-Vietnam. And now everybody knew who they were. That's a good example of narcissism.
Sensation seeking.
Sensation seeking follows the same train of thought. You know, you have bungee jumping, you have skydiving, and for some people you join a terrorist group. It's like the movie Goodfellas, and you teach someone how to become a mafia guy. I guess it's fun. Well, this is again rare.
But these sound like more like gangs that then really act out. And we have some of that here. And I'm trying to think, I want to say there's a number with it. It's 21 or something. There's a group identified with a number, and it's their pockets all around the country.
And they do it out of sensation.
The failure to achieve diplomacy.
That is the death of statescraft. When diplomacy failed, when two enemy entities meet and try to reach an agreement, and after a few years, possibly after a few decades, no agreement has been reached. So what do they do next? They use terrorism.
And do people turn to terrorism, and this one before religion, when they can't communicate? When communication doesn't work, you can't work out your differences, then you commit
When
acts of
diplomacy
terror?
fails, sometimes people resort to terrorism.
The attack on Pearl Harbor, it began World War II for the United States. Of these 14 so far, what would you define that as? That was terrorism. It was an attack on us. Which of these would have fit that?
I wouldn't call that terrorism. It was more as an act of war. It was definitely a surprise attack. It was heinous. But it was the Japanese Imperial Army basically dropping bombs in Pearl Harbor. So I wouldn't call it terrorism, more of an act of war. A surprise attack.
So a surprise attack doesn't define...
Not in that context.
Okay. And then this is the one, the big one, religion.
Well, religion, as most of us can imagine, is a massive motivator for a lot of groups today to do what they do. You have Islam, you have also Aum Shinrikyo. And this is a group that few people know, but Aum, A-U-M, or Aum Shinrikyo, was a Japanese terrorist group in the 1990s, and it was a mixture of Eastern religions, of Buddhism, of a New Age, and they said that the whole world was wrong and only they knew the whole truth. So they wanted to obliterate the entire world by using a special type of toxic gas, and the plan did not go as planned, fortunately. It was called sarin, S-A-R-I-N, and sarin gas, once you're exposed to it, you don't live long. So they had sarin in capsules. They went to the Tokyo subway. I don't know if you know anything about Tokyo, Yokohama. It's 36 million people. And the Tokyo subway is attended by 4 million people every day. So they go to the Tokyo subway. They release those capsules, but only 12 people die. The plan did not go as planned. See, that would be an example of a cooked-up religion that was made by Shoko Asahara, who was caught by the Japanese, and he's going to die by hanging. In the case of Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, of course, that's Islamism, and they get motivated by the Quran, by the Hadith.
When chemical weapons were used during World War I, we never defined that as terrorism.
It was mustard gas. I know that the German army used mustard gas. It was in defiance of the Geneva Convention. And during the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Germany was punished for many reasons, including that one. The German troops were accused of using weapons that were unconventional, that were forbidden, that were cowardly weapons.
How aware is the general population of how and why terrorism exists?
9/11 woke up a lot of people. So a lot of people are aware. They definitely see the tip of the iceberg, but as you know, an iceberg is 90% submerged. So do they see the whole iceberg? Not everybody sees the whole iceberg. It would take a lot of attention, a lot of passion to delve into a subject that a lot of people are afraid of. But I'm sure that virtually everybody has a general idea of what terrorism is. Now, do they all understand why we have terrorism? No. So that's why I'm here, just to explain.
Tell me this, in your opinion, is the United Nations an effective mechanism to minimize terrorism?
To minimize terrorism, no. The blue helmets, as we call the UN soldiers, a lot of them have no weapons. They're here just to maintain social order. They're here to make us aware of war rape in the Congo, to make us aware of the lack of sanitation for 2.5 billion people. Are United Nations soldiers effective at just pushing back terrorist groups? No, they're not.
Senator Bob Graham, in an interview right here at Embry-Riddle 3 years ago, said that the Hamas and the Hezbollah were more dangerous than any of the people we were going to get. Osama bin Laden, any of the other capital names that were out there. Do you believe that the Hezbollah and the Hamas are still the greatest terrorist risk to the United States?
Let me start with Hezbollah, the Party of God that was created in 1982. Hezbollah has hundreds of thousands of people. It is a Shia terrorist group, and they have a presence in over 100 countries, including Mexico. As I've mentioned earlier, they're joining forces with Mexican drug lords, and a lot of tunnels have been discovered in Tijuana, and Tijuana is south of San Diego. So not only do they smuggle weapons, they also smuggle people.
There is a concern.
Hamas, and for the second one, Hamas, of course, is less dangerous in North America, but they're definitely dangerous in the Middle East and in the Near East.
We're going to take questions from the audience. Be thinking of what you would like to ask, and we'll come from left to right, and you can ask your questions of Dr. Matusitz in the next few moments. I want to ask this because this is very sensitive, but it's important. There was, I think, a misperception when we were putting this program on that this was going to be an anti-Islam night. The purpose of this discussion from the very beginning was to educate and highlight the different fashions of terrorism, how it happens and why. And this is what Dr. Matusitz is doing. There are peaceful Muslims. I have friends who are of the Islam faith, and they're peace-loving people. You have had people protest almost every place you've gone to. Why is that happening?
Well, some groups don't like it when people use terrorism and Islam in the same sentence. We have a lot of cultural Muslims, a lot of peaceful Muslims, I know that, but they're not the ones we have to worry about. We have to worry about a small percentage of Muslims who join terrorist groups and who have an agenda.
Does it make it more difficult for peace-loving Muslims to exist in a society if we stigmatize those who are Muslim?
If you look at the victims of Islamist terrorism in countries like Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, in Central Asia, and in the Middle East, most victims are Muslims themselves. In fact, during Ramadan, that's when you hear, if you turn on the television, when you hear that a mosque was being blown up, it happens the most during Ramadan because that's when Muslims go to the mosque the most, even in these parts of the world during Ramadan.
Has that happened recently? I was not aware of that. Can you give us an example when that happened?
Over the course of the past 5 months, it's happened in Iraq and Pakistan. Oh, definitely.
There was a discussion today, there was a friendly fire incident in Afghanistan in which 4 or 5 people were killed. It was unfortunate.
And the president is upset. The Karzai president, Karzai, the Afghan president. Now, it was a mistake on the part of the United States. So they killed 5 people in Afghanistan, supposedly by mistake.
You say supposedly, you
well,
have doubts?
I wasn't there, so.
Do you have doubt as to whether they were killed by mistake?
Well, I don't think that America killed them intentionally.
Okay.
But I wasn't there.
Okay.
Right.
Do you suspect that when our commitment to Afghanistan is over, that Al-Qaeda will overrun the country?
The problem is that when we go to a Middle Eastern country and when we leave, somebody else takes over. If we leave Iraq, Iran's going to take over. That's my theory.
What's the constructive message that you've wanted to give to students and the general public about terrorism so that we could actually improve and understand the situation?
One word, awareness. I want them to become more aware and to make other people aware of terrorism across the world.
Is it because they become victims if they're not aware?
Too many people, in my opinion, are too complacent to what's going on. I want to go back home and kiss my wife and my children. I want to watch The Big Bang Theory. How about you just watch the news? How about you focus more on this? I wish it were happening more.
Well, there's an awful lot of people.
So the answer is awareness.
Okay, there's an awful lot of people that don't watch the news and they don't know what's going on. They are watching Big Bang Theory. All right, we're going to come through the audience, and as mentioned earlier, we hope to keep questions brief and to the point. And if you could speak up and your question directly to Dr. Matusitz. Welcome. Thank you for coming to Embry-Riddle tonight.
Thank you. My question is over here.
Who?
It's all right. You don't have to give names, just your question.
Oh, there you go.
If the goal of these terrorists is to get as much attention for their group as they can, and you go back to the advent of the 24-hour news cycle, all the channels that are out there, the internet, Twitter, today, any act of terrorism is reported millions of times in just maybe the first 10 minutes versus back in the 60s where it might have been reported 100 times in days. So the advent of technology and the use of it that we have really makes it perfect for terrorism to be the #1 way for your group to get attention.
Absolutely. There is a symbiotic relationship between the media and terrorism. Terrorism attracts the media, and the media attract terrorism.
So do we glorify terrorism by mass media coverage?
We don't glorify terrorism, but we make everyone aware of terrorism. And by the same token, now everybody knows who Al-Qaeda is. Until 9/11, I had no idea who Al-Qaeda was. Everybody knows who Osama bin Laden is. So,
over here, your question. Good evening.
Are there any states, like any countries out there, that would use a terrorist group to complement their conventional forces?
so are we using their terrorist groups to meet our goal?
No. Like a nation with a standing army with tanks and fighter planes and all that, would they also have a plan to use a terrorist group to complement their conventional forces if they were going against another nation?
Well, as most of us know, Iran has been accused of using Hezbollah. In fact, according to the United States, the country of Iran is a terrorist country. Syria has been accused of the same. In the 1970s, Argentina, with a dirty war, with a capital D, capital W, the dirty war, was using state repression. And state repression is when you have a standing army, an official army, and you're using terrorism on the side. So they're using both an army and terrorist practices.
In the audience now, your question.
Welcome, first of all. And you spoke about the definition of terrorism.
Yes, I gave a definition.
Yeah, we asked just if you missed the explanation of what terrorism was?
No, I know, I'm just addressing it. That you spoke about the definition of terrorism, and you spoke about the Palestinians. I don't know if you've been to Palestine, first of all, but what I wanted to ask was, are the oppressors themselves of Palestine terrorists? Would they be terrorists towards the Palestinian people?
So, do some of the Palestinian terrorists kill their own people?
No, I'm talking about the oppressors inside the occupation of Palestine. Would the oppressors be seen as terrorists?
So, for example, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces?
Talking about the Israelis' invasions.
So your question is, do I think they're terrorists? No, I don't think the IDF, people like the IDF are terrorists. I would say that in that part of the world, Palestinian suicide bombers are terrorists. Isn't that one question per person?
We're going to go over here and then come back. Way back here, your question.
Good afternoon, sir. My question is for you on the awareness aspect. You said, everyone wants to go home and see their families and have a good time, but they should be more aware. I could agree with that to a certain extent, but to what point would that be paranoia? Because I feel like that's the ultimate goal of terrorism, is to strike terror in the people. So if they're going home and they're always being constantly aware, at what point does that become paranoia?
Now, I was not inferring that you always have to focus on terrorism. Paranoia is an extreme state, an extreme feeling. But in my opinion, you have a certain number of people who don't care about this at all, and I think they should care.
We want to go back and forth, so I want to ask a different person, and then come back and give people who would like to ask a follow-up or a different question, because I want to get more voices on. Who has a question on this side? Right down here in the front, or right there. Go ahead, sir.
Just Guantanamo, in the context of what you're explaining, how does that fit in your 15?
Okay,
how does Guantanamo fit in to what you've discussed? In other words, you're talking about the actual camp? Because if you could speak up, because we couldn't hear your question.
Yes, the prison situation in Guantanamo is often used as a reason that sparks terrorism. I mean, what would your response be to that?
Are the people who are at Guantanamo, in other words, fostering the fact that we're holding them there, does that foster terrorism?
Well, that's what Osama bin Laden was saying. That's what the Egyptian doctor, the new Al-Qaeda leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, is saying. Guantanamo is a detention camp. It's a U.S. naval base in Cuba. Is it a reason for which we have terrorism? Terrorism existed way before Guantanamo was created.
Right over here.
Hi, Mark. I think the group you were trying to think about earlier was MS-13.
MS-13, thank you.
Central American terrorist-type group.
That's in Central America, right?
Yes, sir.
Right.
Dr. Matusitz, my compliments to you just as an average citizen. you hit the right word, awareness. We in America take everything for granted. There's no question about that. We hear the left, the right, we hear so many different things, which prompts this question to you. In the past couple of years, we saw the decline of the government in Egypt. We saw the problems obviously occurring in Syria. We saw what occurs with Libya with the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. In America, there is concern that we are backing the wrong forces in those three parts of the world. My question to you is, sir, is America's presence in those areas, are we getting involved with the proper groups that are trying to restore some type of stability in those regions, or, as suspected, are there terrorist organizations that are being involved in those areas?
Well, the Obama administration was accused of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood against Hosni Mubarak. It's a concern because the Muslim Brotherhood has spawned groups like Hamas, like Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden was the member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And now a lot of Egyptians are afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, Egypt recently designated the MB, the Muslim Brotherhood, as a terrorist organization. Russia did the same thing. So sometimes we're supporting the wrong side, that's for sure.
And I want to thank you for that. The MS-13 that the gentleman was able to help me with is a transnational criminal gang that originated in Los Angeles and has spread to other parts of the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Central America. The majority of the gang is ethnically composed of Central Americans and active in urban and suburban areas. In the United States, MS-13 has especially a heavy presence in Los Angeles County, the San Francisco Bay Area, Washington, D.C., metropolitan areas of Fairfax County, Virginia, Montgomery County, Maryland, and Prince George's County in Maryland, along with, this started in one area, Long Island, New York, Boston, Charlotte, Houston. And there's also a presence now of MS-13 in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We talked to the sheriff of Volusia County, and he said they're very hard to find, but they're everywhere.
That's probably because they operate on the structure of cells. So they don't have a central command, they don't have any headquarters, and they have cells of 3, 5, possibly 10 people, or maybe one person everywhere. They're scattered.
Up front, your question now for Dr. Matusitz.
I hear many Americans say it's our fault that the terrorists hate us because we are wronging them in some way. Isn't it true that a lot of the hatred and the reason they're attacking Americans also is because we're just different? And if that's the case, if we're just different, or say we're Christian versus Muslim, say our women go more scantily clad than maybe their women do, just because we're different, if we're inviting all this terror because of those reasons, are we not justifiably more enabled to take them out then?
The first part of your question brings up a concept called blowback theory. And blowback theory says that America goes abroad, and because of that, we're getting blowback from groups like Al-Qaeda and Hamas. To address the second half of your question, the goal of these groups, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, is to establish a global caliphate, a grand Islamic state. So no matter what we do, that's their agenda.
In the front, Ray Sanchez, your question.
Dr. Matusitz, thank you so much for coming. And
thank you.
You give very good, I guess, reasons for terrorism and going through terrorism. But in your book, or you maybe can comment here, do you have what is the most effective ways of combating terrorism and what you think is the best way? Because as we know, like you said, there's cells and it's so hard to combat. But do you have in your book, I guess, some suggestions on the best way to combat terrorism?
Well, the book is about communication, not so much about tactical strategies. See, there's two types of terrorism. You have homegrown terrorism and international terrorism. Homegrown terrorism can be combated by operating on the principle that prevention is better than cure. So anybody coming from any country that has some questionable background should not enter our country.
Way back here, question now.
How does the misinterpretation of religion affect terrorism?
Do you think it's misinterpretation of religion, or it's following the core principle of the core principles of the religion?
Misinterpretation.
If it's misinterpretation of religion, that would be hijacking a religion. And if you follow the core of the religion, that would be religious fundamentalism. Some religions have been hijacked, other religions are just following their mainstream fundamentalism. And I'm not going to list them.
Do you maintain then that there is a core function within a religion that's purpose is terrorism?
I wouldn't say that the purpose is terrorism, but some religions have a specific agenda that they need to fulfill. If they cannot fulfill the agenda in a peaceful way, they're going to use more violent means.
But doesn't that undo the whole prophecy of their faith if they act in violence? Because isn't there a common belief with all different faiths of peace and love? And if you strike out at another person to get them to see your way of thought, you're undoing your faith?
Well, some religions have 90, 150 sects that contradict each other.
Which is,
but even in Christianity, you have, for example, Christian fundamentalism. And the Christian identity movement says that only white Christians should be called Christians. So even, I would say, a lot of religions have conflicting sects within them.
Where are you on this side? Way back here.
So if you give all these reasons for why terrorism exists and why these people, terrorists, are doing what they do, are you not, by their justifying terrorism?
If I am justifying terrorism? No.
Right.
No. I'm not sure I get the question. I'm explaining 15 reasons why terrorism exists.
Not justifying, he's explaining why the incidents happened, sir.
Did I answer your question? All right.
Way back here. Kyle, do you have someone?
Good evening, Dr. Matusitz. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
In the Homeland Security program here at Embry-Riddle, we are taught that highly kinetic military solutions are not the most effective at combating transnational asymmetric insurgency or terrorism. What is your take on that? What's the most effective tool?
Well, you know, I can say, for example, that changing a culture from the bottom up is one way to do it. It's very difficult to change a doctrine, especially a doctrine that's bent on killing us. So I believe that killing the target of attack and the target of influence is the way to go.
How much of our way of life is so offensive to other people that they feel that they have to act out to exterminate us? Is that common?
Well, if you look at what George W. Bush said in 2001, in October of 2001, at the joint session of Congress, he said, referring to groups like Al-Qaeda, they hate us, they hate our freedom, they hate our freedom of religion, they hate the fact that we're meeting here freely. So I think that really captures the essence of what you said.
But I also wonder,
it's like a clash of civilizations.
But it was, and I think it was based on something that was said in the audience too, and I'm wondering if that plays into it. The way we dress, the way we act, the amount of skin we show, all of that. Does that bring out violence in other people because it's so against what they believe is proper?
Yes, I can give an example. One of the supreme leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, his name was Sayyid Qutb, Q-U-T-B. And Sayyid Qutb, at the end of the 1940s, from Egypt, went to the United States. He lived here for a few years, and he said that America was basically a whorehouse. People live in debauchery, people live in sin and corruption, and in Arabic is jahiliyyah. And jahiliyyah is a state of divine ignorance. And so he went back to Egypt, and he wrote a book that has become the Bible for global jihadism, and the book is Milestones, that was published in the 1950s. So that would be an example of a direct attack on our lifestyles. It would be like, what? Girls have bikinis at the beaches? What? You guys do this? So,
over here, your question. Good evening.
I know that Osama bin Laden was heavily inspired by Sayyid Qutb and his Milestones book.
Yes, sir.
In Syria today, you got different Muslim sects fighting against each other. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a chance if Israel should feel threatened and strikes against Syria, do you think that there's a chance that all the Muslim sects will unite in a common enemy against Israel, which would draw us into...
Yes, understand that Israel is 700 times smaller than the people surrounding the country. So they receive threats, they feel threatened by Syria, by Lebanon. And in Syria, You have the Syrian government oppressing its own people, and you have some of the Syrian rebel groups beheading Christians and attacking people. So in my opinion, both sides are not clean. Both sides have a lot of blood on their hands.
Of some of the societies that you spoke of that are involved, a sector of these societies involved in terrorism, do the good people from these cultures ever speak up and say, this is not the way to be?
In a lot of these places, in places like Pakistan, like Somalia, if you speak up, if you have your own television program, if you point the finger at people, you may not stay alive a long time. See, out of fear. A lot of people there want to have nothing to do with terrorism, with jihad, but a lot of people are afraid. I think it's the fear factor, unfortunately.
Back up in the audience. Good evening.
Good evening. I'd like to ask you a question with respect to
If we could ask you to speak up just a little.
You brought up awareness, and I'd like to look at it from a different perspective. In recent light with the NSA revelations about cyber attack on foreign officials, I'd like your opinion on how American actions that are classified by the military and other organizations have contributed towards the sympathy by terrorist groups against America.
I'm not sure I understand.
I think he's saying, I want to make sure I understood you correctly, sir. The actions of Americans are perceived as...
No, what I'd like to say is not your American ideology, but the actions taken by some certain agencies abroad, such as covert military operations.
Okay, let me do this in pieces.
Like the NSA. The
NSA acting abroad.
And the collateral damage from 2 wars. I'd like to have your opinion on how much it's contributed towards the terrorist antipathy against America.
Well, let me talk about the NSA. The NSA is resented not just by people in the Middle East, but even by people in Germany. So according to people like Edward Snowden, who released cables, the NSA was investigating and was just tapping phone conversations of Angela Merkel, the chancellor in Germany. So sure, a lot of these organizations, because of their actions, are resented. But then again, there's a lot of things that we don't know what's going on. See, we're here talking. I'm sure there are many things that we don't know are happening.
We have an email question from one of our listeners listening on WNDB radio. Is jealousy of our way of life a reason why terrorists act out?
I wouldn't say that jealousy in and of itself is a massive motivator to lead people to commit terrorist attacks. I would say it's the same term of clash of civilizations.
What went on in my mind when I read that was the haves and the have-nots. Those who don't have any. It goes back to one of your points about being in poverty, that they resent us because we have so much enrich us.
In the case of the Palestinian suicide bombers, their life on earth, from their perspective, is a life of abject misery. And according to the Hadith, they're promised 72 virgins and 80,000 servants and eternal life. So of course, for them, it's incentivizing. So in that case, there is relative deprivation. Now, do they hate us, America, based on that fact alone? I would say maybe partly, but that's not the only reason.
Over here, your question. Good evening.
Good evening. Just to make people aware that the Holy Quran is the holiest book for all Muslims around the world. And the Hadith is like the second holiest book. Just my question, as you mentioned earlier, how would Quran and Hadith motivate for terrorism? I just want your take on this.
So, do the Quran and the Hadith lead people to commit terrorism?
Yeah. How would it? No, as you mentioned, as you just mentioned earlier, Quran and Hadith would motivate for terrorism. I just want you to tell me how Quran and Hadith motivate for terrorism, as you mentioned.
Well, certain verses in the Quran are very clear. For example, going back to the Palestinian suicide bombers, is chapter 9, verse 111. If you die in jihad, if you die in holy war, and if you kill people in the process, you will reach the highest place in paradise. So that verse has motivated people to kill. It's a fact that has been ascertained and validated. So some verses definitely motivate some groups to do what they do. Now, some hadiths are considered fraud, forgery, but the volume written by al-Bukhari 1,000 years ago is considered more credible than most hadith. In fact, al-Bukhari is considered the most credible hadith author by Muslims who understand Islam.
Up this area, your question, good evening.
Yes, thank you. Do you think that because of the constant oppression, impoverished areas, that terrorism could be considered a subculture in some of these areas?
Well, it's definitely a subculture in many areas of the world. In Chechnya, it's probably a subculture, the subculture of revenge.
Are there governments that are willing partners of terrorists? Do we know them? In other words, they sort of fold their arms and say, we're not going to do this because we're the elected government, but we know these sectors exist. We're just going to let them do what they have to do.
Well, I mentioned the country of Iran. I mean, Iran definitely has helped Hezbollah. That there's no question about that. So do we let them do what they do because we have
not necessarily us, but other countries? Maybe it goes on here too. I mean, are there cases where there are terrorists that are acting in this country and the government knows about it but doesn't do anything about it?
So do our agencies turn a blind eye on terrorist activities or pre-terrorist activities? I don't know. I hope not.
Other countries, do you think that goes on in other countries?
Oh, definitely in some countries, and I won't mention them. There's no question about that.
Way back here.
You know, we talk about the peaceful Muslims and the radical Muslims, which we consider to be about 10%. But my question is when the radical Muslims start to pressure the peaceful Muslims, will they stand up for what the love that they claim they have, that they get to enjoy in America under the liberty we have, and stand up and die instead of submitting to the oppression of the minority?
Well, I would like peaceful and cultural Muslims in many countries on earth to stand up more. But again, out of fear, some of them don't stand up. Should Americans have a fear of Sharia law? I hear people tell me this all the time. Sharia law is coming. Is it coming to the United States? Well, it's not going to be here anytime soon, but of course, if we're too complacent, it may come here in a few centuries. See, understand that Sharia is not compatible with our Constitution.
Because of mercy killings? What? Why?
Well, because of the main tenets of Sharia. Basically, it has freedom of speech restrictions, which contradicts the First Amendment.
Over here, sir. Good evening.
I get the impression that our current administration thinks we should not fight terrorism, but we should negotiate with them. Is that a possibility?
Has Barack Obama said that we should not fight terrorism?
Said that was an impression you were getting?
That's the impression I got. When he went to Cairo and he made a speech, he wanted to make friends with the Muslim Brotherhood and other organizations. I get the impression that he's not out for a physical fight, but he gives the impression that he wants to negotiate with them to settle issues.
In my opinion, inviting the Muslim Brotherhood openly there was a mistake, but I don't think that he refuses to fight terrorism. So he does fight terrorism. As far as negotiating with terrorists, for me, that would be a no-no. Never negotiate with terrorists.
How active is
they have a very different agenda.
I beg your pardon. How active is the Muslim Brotherhood in North America?
Oh, it's very active. The Muslim Brotherhood is very active in America, in many countries. It's very active in Belgium, where I come from. They have what we call Sharia for Belgium in my country. They have Sharia for the UK. It's active in many, many countries. Understand that 1 billion Muslims are directly or indirectly affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood.
I had a question that came in from one of our listeners that wanted to know is how does the Asian sector of this world deal with terrorism? Do they handle terrorism? The Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, do they handle domestic terrorism differently than Western countries do, and how do they do it?
I don't think they handle it differently from we do. I mean, they do have a lot of terrorist groups. For example, in China, you have the Uyghurs in western provinces of the country. And these are separatist terrorist groups. See, in Asia, you have a lot of separatist terrorist groups. Groups of people who want to be independent. So that's why they commit terrorist attacks.
Way in the back, your question.
Okay, my question is, you mentioned freedom fighters earlier in your presentation. So my question is there good terrorism? If you look at the American Revolutionary fighters, we won, but during the 1760s through 1790s, when we were fighting British, we were freedom fighters, we were terrorists, we just happened to win. If you look at the Tamil Tigers, they lost, but they're claimed as terrorists. If you look at the followers of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, so can there be a good form of terrorism?
No, because don't look at what they say, look at what they do. Tamil Tigers use suicide belts, they use terrorist practices. During the revolution here, we use no terrorist practices.
Hold on one second.
Suicide bombings?
Want to hear you.
We used unconventional methods for the time. During that time, war was men on line, facing each other, front line shoots, they take a knee, second line shoots, they take a knee, third line shoots, they take a knee.
There were different methods.
If you look at Francis Marion in South Carolina, how he fought, that was completely unconventional. They would ambush the British soldiers. My question is, we won. The revolutionary soldiers won, so it's okay. Why is that not considered terrorism? Why is that not wrong?
Let me go back to the Tamil Tigers. The Tamil Tigers have a suicide belt and a moped, and they blow themselves up next to a tourist bus, killing a lot of civilians. Did we do anything like this during the American Revolution? We used rifles, and we used some of the techniques we used, but I doubt George Washington and Ben Franklin were terrorists.
For the students in your class, what do you want them to do with what they learn in this class? How will they apply it in their lives?
Well, a class on terrorism, unlike a class on engineering, is less applicable to real life. It's more an awareness class. It's more of a theoretical class. So it's not really applicable. And I'm not telling them to buy Glock 17 or no, that's not the case. It's more about information and how to understand the concept of terrorism better. So it's not a hands-on class.
Do you find that the students generally are aware of much of this, they just haven't focused on it, or are they totally blown away by what you're teaching?
Look at the term blown away. That's right in the proper context. Right?
I thought I was going to walk into that at some point. Here we go, up front.
Well, yeah, go.
Hi, my question to you is, have you studied Quran and Al-Bukhari in its entirety? Do you read Arabic? Do you understand Arabic?
Well, I do not speak Arabic, but I have studied the Quran. I have a lot of copies of the Quran. Now, the Hadith by Al-Bukhari is like this. So it would take, before I get to that entirely, it will take some time.
Shouldn't you wait to judge a religion till you finish reading about it completely?
Well, you're telling me that a lot of Muslims themselves don't speak Arabic. A lot of Hebrews, a lot of Jewish people don't speak Hebrew. So I have a lot of translations of the Quran in English.
Let's mic her so she can be heard, ma'am. Go ahead.
And you agree that you have not studied Quran in its entirety and you have started judging the religion. That's wrong.
Is it your assessment, ma'am? Stay with us for a moment. Is it your assessment that he cannot speak to the issue completely until he has studied all of the Quran?
Yes. To pass a judgment, we have to know the subject in its entirety. Otherwise, you cannot judge just by the acts of few terrorists. That's what I feel you are doing right now. You are judging a religion by the acts of few terrorists. That's wrong.
Well, you made
because
a statement
I am a Muslim, and I believe in peace, and I can die for America because this is my country. I can die for America.
Point counterpoint?
I will not
But you're
think
saying
twice.
that-
Hold on, ma'am. Let him respond. Don't go away. Let him respond. Go ahead, John.
You're saying that because I don't speak Arabic, I will never know the subject entirely.
No,
That's
I'm not
wrong.
saying that.
A lot of Muslims don't speak Arabic.
You are right. I am from India. But I have read and understood Quran from its translation, from its Maulvis, from my parents and grandparents. I know the hadiths. I can read Arabic, but I don't speak Arabic. But I have read, I'm still reading. I am a Muslim for the last 40 years. I'm still reading Quran. I have not completed yet. How can you judge a religion by just copying some verses?
Well, you're making assumptions about me. Then why do 90% of suicide bombings happen in the Middle East? Why do most terrorist attacks today happen in certain
Terrorists
places?
exist in all countries, in all religions. But some people pick and choose who they want to link some terrorists to Islam. That's not right. You don't link Timothy McVeigh to Christianity. Why do you then? So you should not link terrorism to any religion, because no religion on this earth teaches violence. Every religion says, encourages peace. And for your information, is to be a good Muslim, according to Islam, we should believe in Jesus Christ. We should believe in Moses to be a good Muslim. And also in Quran, it says in one of the verses that if you kill a human being, you are killing the entire humanity. You take the...
Okay.
Let me
Okay, let's let him
All right.
address this, ma'am. Thank you.
I did not expect to get a ranting here, but I will address your ranting. The
Well,
Quran.
it's okay, let him speak.
The Quran mentions the names of Jesus, Moses, Abraham, a lot of names that appear in the Bible. Same names, different people. The Quranic Jesus was not the Son of God. So what you're doing is taqiyya. Taqiyya means deception.
We're not going to settle everything here. Let's go back in the audience now and your question. We want to get as many voices. We have precious minutes left. Hello. Thank you for being with us.
I wanted to talk about the oppression of the Palestinian people.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question.
Go ahead with your question.
I am a Christian, and you said that 90% of bombings or suicides or whatever it was from the Middle East. I'm a Christian born to a Palestinian father. Why can I not go back to my country? Why have I never seen my country and am I not allowed back there? That is my question to you.
Well, I don't know if I can answer your question. First of all, you may go back to your country. So you're making the assumption that one day...
I am not allowed there.
By your own State Department, you're not allowed to return to your
I'm
native
not
country?
allowed there due to the operation, the invasion by the oppression.
Are all people in your situation?
There are many people in my situation. My dad just lost his citizenship.
Why?
Because of the oppression.
Well, of course, one day it may change, but again, it's...
I don't understand why there's an invasion towards our country and why we're being wiped away from our country.
With all due respect, and I'm not doubting your testimony, we can't solve that, we can't answer that, because we're having a greater discussion on terrorism. That is a State Department issue. We won't be able to answer your question, sir.
We're terrorists.
I can't answer your question. We can't get it answered. I don't know what the details are of this situation, so we can't answer it.
Okay, thank you. But advice, I suggest that you go visit the Middle East because it's not the way you say it is. Not everyone, we're not jealous of your way of life. Your way of life is so much like ours. Look at the way I'm dressed. Look at the way I speak.
The young man raises a question. Have you ever gone to any of these countries that you talk about in your classes?
I've never been to Gaza or the West Bank, but you're assuming that I made a generalization, and I did not.
Okay, let me come over here. Your question. Good evening. Easy, Alyssa.
Why would you relate anti-terrorism to Islam? And if terrorism happens here in America, you don't relate it to the person, religion?
No, I don't.
I'm sorry, we can't understand.
If let's say, a terrorism happened in the United States, why don't you relate it to this person, religion? But if a Muslim does a terrorism attack, you right away relate it to his religion. And his religion, you know...
I'm sorry, sir, we can't understand the question. It's too convoluted. I'm going to give you one more try at this.
Okay.
Can you make it simple?
The question is, why would you relate a terrorism attack to Muslim while if there was a terrorism attack in the United States or somewhere else? You don't relate it to the person, religion.
I'll try to answer the question. If you read my book, I talk about Islamist terrorism, I talk about Christian terrorism, I talk about all kinds of religions.
What's an example of Christian terrorism?
Well, for example,
modern Christian terrorism.
The Christian identity movement. And the Christian identity movement operates on the principle that the true Christians are this elite group of people, the white Aryans.
And what do? They kill those that don't agree? How do they act out?
Definitely, they burn down their houses, they target their belongings, and they've done some killings.
And we see, would you define those who act out against abortion clinics as terrorists?
Oh, definitely, definitely, right? That's anti-abortion terrorism, like the AOG, the Army of God. Now, understand that the number of anti-abortion killings in the past 20 years has been just minimal.
In the audience now, sir.
You were mentioning some verses of the Quran, some hadith. Do you know some of these are cherry-picked, for example, by Al-Qaeda to suit their own ideas? Now, a colleague mentioned that misinterpretation of religion might cause terrorism, but you said it's the core of the religion. So due to these verses of the Quran and hadith having the context, by cherry-picking them, not understanding the context, aren't they misinterpreting the religion?
So are they hijacking the religion? Well, if you read the communique, the speeches by Osama bin Laden, if you read the mission statements of a lot of these groups, they're saying they're following the core of the religion, so they would disagree with you. Now, as I've said before, I would like peaceful cultural Muslims to stand up more against these things. But again, out of fear, they're not going to do it.
Right over here, and then we'll come back to Alyssa over here.
You've mentioned Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq. I want to ask you, why the relationship between terrorism and Israel?
Well, one of the goals of many jihadist groups is to take Israel, Jerusalem, Al-Quds al-Sharif, the noble holy place. And tradition has it that Al-Quds was the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven. It is the third holiest place. So number 1 is Mecca, number 2 is Medina, and number 3 is Al-Quds. So if you read the mission statements of Hamas, Hezbollah, and jihadist groups, they want to take Jerusalem, they want to take Israel. So that's why, like you said, there are tensions between Israel and all these groups in Pakistan, Afghanistan.
We have time for a couple more questions back here.
I'm having a trouble understanding the difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist. Isn't it in the eyes of the beholder? And isn't Afghanistan a wonderful study in freedom fighters versus terrorists?
Are freedom fighters, we hear this often, freedom fighters and terrorists, are they the same?
Well, we call them terrorists, they call themselves freedom fighters. It's a matter of semantics. We call them suicide bombers, they call themselves martyrs, heroes. So of course they have a different worldview, they have a different understanding of the world, a different frame of reference. So that's where the discrepancy between what we call them and what they refer to themselves comes from.
Very short on time. Sir, thank you for being with us tonight. Your question.
One of the reasons you've cited for terrorism is obviously a nation's or people's self-determination and right for that, and with the United States as an example. But another example would be the state of Israel, and obviously you've mentioned in your book groups like the Levy and Irgun who have used bombings and other things to achieve their political goal as a part of Zionism. You're obviously a member of Kufi, Christians United for Israel. Do you think that you have a bias because of maybe the political ideology in Zionism towards the religion of Islam, and do you think that influences your work?
No, I wouldn't call myself a Zionist. I'm a Christian.
Are you in that organization, by the way?
Yes, it just started at UCF. So I'm the faculty advisor. It started 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they were looking for someone, and I said yes. For sure, the IDF has not always been clean. Are they a terrorist group? No. No.
Right here, Arthur.
When we talked about freedom fighters and the difference between freedom fighters and terrorists, someone mentioned the revolution. I see the difference as being whether they attack military targets or civilian targets. Do you see that? Am I
correct?
Well, look at Hezbollah, what they did in October of 1983. They went to the Marine barracks in Beirut, and they had two truck bombs that killed 241 people. The targets were military, but the incident was still called a terrorist attack.
I want to say I've got time for one more question. Did we get everybody? Oh, right up front. Sir, your question. Thank you for being with us tonight.
You have been, I heard some of your video speeches, and I'm surprised that whenever you raise the question of Quran motivating terrorism and all that, you are irrelevant because at the same time, you have been mentioning Osama bin Laden.
If you could speak right into the microphone, we're having trouble hearing.
Bukhari and all that. So Osama bin Laden is an individual. He's not a prophet. He has nothing to do. He might be following the religion of Islam, but he has no authority to say anything about terrorism or motivating people, Muslims towards terrorism.
Let me address your question.
It's a mistaken identity.
Well, Osama bin Laden was considered, and he considered himself as the direct successor to the Prophet Muhammad. We know he was not, but that's how he saw himself.
We're running out of time, I apologize, sir, for having to stop, but I want to thank several people who helped make this possible tonight. Chris and Brendan up in control, Alyssa and Kyle who work with the audience here, and Jerry Kenny at Kenny TV, our friends at C-SPAN who came to be with us tonight for this event, and Chand Wara back at WNDB for producing tonight's event. It will be broadcast once again on 1150 WNDB, and we will let you know when our partners at C-SPAN are going to be carrying this, most likely within the next month. I want to tell you about our next event coming up. It's going to be on the 18th. Congressman Ron DeSantis will be back for a live town hall, and you're all invited to come and ask your questions of Congressman DeSantis in a live broadcast. Again, that will be the 18th right here at Embry-Riddle's Gail Lemron Auditorium. I want to remind you that Dr. Matusitz will be selling some of his DVDs in just a moment, and you can come by. If you can line up to that side, you can say hello and pick up a copy. He'll be making those sales right here. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, Dr. Jonathan Matusitz. On behalf of Dr. John Johnson, thank you for being with us for tonight's President Speakers event from Embry-Riddle.